We will be taking questions through the Q&A, and our first question or response is one for Nigel. Nigel, the question really relates to, or the comment really relates to the role of good design and BAL construction versus the role of preparing properties. Is that a question that you can see in the chat, and would you like to respond to?
Obviously, Rachel, Kevin, both are very important. The first slide I said was about siting. And then we've heard from the other two speakers about the defendable space, the maintenance, all those qualities are up front. But Kevin, you've got to understand that embers, as I said, 80 to 90% of house losses are from embers which can be kilometres away from the main fire front. Think, for example, of the 2003-2004 Canberra fires, when buildings were lost half a kilometre inland from the edge of the fire front, when whole streets were lost, all because embers ignited, often the vegetation, not always, sometimes even the doormat, burning, no one around, it was enough to ignite the building. And then what we learned from the Canberra fires was house-to-house fire, or the fence, the timber fence, burning and then igniting next door, because we need it all. We have to site carefully, we have to prepare, we have to have defendable space. But my key point was the regulations will mandate a BAL assessment, and all of your building materials will have to respond to whatever the BAL rating actually is. So it's all important, do it.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Nigel. And a reminder that tonight's webinar will be recorded and available for viewing. In the meantime, you can also check out the Knowledge Hub and also the exhibitors. And we're really grateful to have the exhibitors who have lended their support to this evening's event. We'll just take a few moments to see if there's any further questions that are coming through the chat. But we have seen one there around the garden design and access for and strategic placement of trees and shrubs. Chris, is there anything else that you'd like to expand upon in terms of some of that understanding the landscape, particularly the water placement and that access?
I mean, it's a really great and long topic, but I say to people, there's 4 basic principles to what I would call a fire-wise garden. And number 1 is that you choose your fire retardant plants. Now, they're not a silver bullet and all bets are off if you don't manage them well. There is increasingly good information that's out there about what is technically a fire-wise plant. Some nurseries have been very dubious because litigation, etc. If people don't manage them, then they're not much use to you. But if you're choosing those fire-wise plants, that's a great start. Then number 2 in relation to that is that's fuel load separation. I say to people, you know, we want to make it an absolute bastard of a time for those embers when they land. So there's no fuel. So you have gaps vertically and horizontally. So if you're keeping your beautiful remnants, that's great. Keep the ladders of ribbony bark off, and you basically are removing that middle story, and you're replacing shrubs with good fire retardant ground covers, stone and gravel mulches, which leads to the third point. In that fire protection zone, your asset protection zone, whatever that zone size is that you've been designated or you're comfortable with, you must use the stone and gravel mulches, preferably recycled ones. Over that fire season, there's no roles for wood and pine bark and street tree prunings and things like pea straw, lupin hay. Man, that's just ember heaven. So over that fire season, you can't use those. And then, really importantly, I know in our part of the world, 1 tonne per hectare per year of fine fuels are landing on your garden every year. So if you are not managing your fire-wise garden within a year or 2, it's lost all of its value, because the first thing to burn is that, like a dust settling, is those fine fuels that are going to accumulate on your garden. So you must manage. And I say a great tip, that the thicker and coarser your rubble mulch, then you can actually use a blower at the right angle and gently move it off. So they're very important things. Water repellency is a massive issue for us in WA. It may not be that much of an issue for you. That's where the water won't go into the soil surface because of water repellency. So we say that well-hydrated plants are going to be more likely to defend you. So, and if you're, in other words, if your plants are full of water because you've got the irrigation going into the soil, then they're less likely to burn. They're going to give off moisture and therefore protect you. So those things are critically important parts of what allows you to have a FireWise garden in design and into the future.
Thanks very much, Chris. We have a question, one for Steve. Is there a list of BAL assessors for the LGA?
For a BPAD bushfire consultants, you can go to the Rural Fire Service website, and there's a link there that takes you to the Fire Protection Association of Australia, FPAA website, and there you can access a list of BPAD accredited bushfire consultants. I'm the only one in the Lithgow area that I know of that is based here, but yeah, just go there, do a search, and all the names will come up. Generally speaking, you can use a self-assessment kit if it's low risk, although in my experience, planning ahead and having that understanding of BAL and other bushfire protection measures ahead of applying for a development application will put you in good stead, so you understand where you're at.
Thanks very
May
much.
I add
Steve.
something to
Sorry,
that?
Nigel.
May I add? Yes, I absolutely agree. If you're low risk, you can use the self-assessment, but it's increasingly technical. And if you've got a BPAD trained advisor, that can be very helpful in shaping what you actually submit to council for your DA. So it's particularly if you're higher extreme, don't do it yourself. I'm an expert. I've worked in this field for 20 years. I've sat on Australian Standards Committee. I will still go to a BPAD trained assessor at anything past BAL 29 because they have the insurance as well as the training to actually give you more certainty than you'll otherwise get. And remember, perhaps I should just, if I can, say something about building cost and insurance. The only real analysis of additional building costs from AAMI Insurance Company 5 years ago, and they looked at a standard project home, and they said, if you're building and it's BAL 40, you could expect to pay $100,000 to $140,000 more than a standard project home cost. If you're building to flame zone, you could be spending $200,000 or more over and above standard project home costs. Now, this is 5 years ago. So it is not insignificant. It is a fundamental change in what we build, where we build, how we build, and the cost of building. And the further point I would make, as a firm believer in looking ahead, preparing for the climate change which is happening with more intense, more frequent bushfires, is we're starting to see in the insurance industry the first moves that the insurance cost will be more directly related to the bushfire attack level, first of all at our local government, and then down even to our street level. And we will be seeing insurance rises in future years based upon the payouts like we've never had in the past. We are moving into totally different territory when it comes to bushfires, design, construction, garden, and building.
That's amazing. And can I add something to that as a kind of an incentive? Sorry, I'll just add something which builds on what Nigel was saying there. I completely agree. And I see a time when councils will be helping their residents do these whole farm plans. They finish the design, they get a stamp at the end of the day with the FireWise planning experts. They can take that to their local insurance company who recognize that stamp, and they'll go, we'll give you a reduction in your premiums because we know if you have a well-designed and you're going to manage that property well, we know you're going to be less of a burden on us, and therefore we can give you an incentive to do the right thing. And again, it's meeting the fireys halfway. It all comes back to that. Why should these amazing men and women risk their lives for a really badly bad design is one thing, but bad management, that's totally in your court. So there's a lot that you can do. And I think that's going to be a really powerful incentive into the future. And the insurance companies can be a massive change agent in this space to really help steer us towards incentivizing good management. And the time will come when you will be able to, if you're selling your rural property, be able to say accredited FireWise plan. And I believe it will attract a premium because people will begin to understand what it means. Just like an energy efficient home, a FireWise home and garden, you know, with the management plan in place, I think will start to attract a premium as well. I think, again, crystal ball gazing, as you were doing, Nigel, I think that's the way we're going to go.
Yep.
Mm.
So we're having a few more questions sent through via the YouTube channel, and a reminder that tonight's presentation will be recorded, and also the PowerPoint slides that you saw tonight would be also available for registered viewers. Chris, while we have you, there is a question in relation to the list of fire retardant trees and shrubs. Is there a list of those available, keeping in mind that that may vary based on the area and also growing conditions?
Absolutely. If I can do a shameless ad break, I wrote a book 2 years ago called A Place in the Country, which is available nationally. And it's a really detailed tome on everything to do with setting up and managing a beautiful, productive, safe and sustainable property. So I've got a list in here, which I've drawn from one of the great publications in Australian history, which is the CFA's Bushfire Landscaping Guide. Full credit to CFA, because there would have been so many lawyers going, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, but they did. And it's such a powerful tool because people are going to put plants in the ground. So I think we're much better off steering them in the right direction. It's not perfect, but it moves them in the right direction. So I know the CFA has that fantastic downloadable publication. Resilience New South Wales, I think, has got some good stuff as well. And again, my book, A Place in the Country, which is available nationally, has a really good list in the back, and that's natives. And that's one thing with the garden designs too. We really try and say, look, it doesn't matter what style of garden you want. If it's cottage plants, if it's succulents, if it's natives, it's productive, it doesn't really matter. You can still follow those principles and have a beautiful garden. Again, we're not wanting to compromise the aesthetics and the joy you get from the garden, but just steering it in the right direction. So I hope that answers your question.
Can I add to that? I agree completely. Country Fire Authority Victoria, that's what the CFA stands for. And it's available online. And why it's particularly powerful is it gives 12 or 13 plant characteristics that assist in FireWise planting. The point about leaf moisture, the leaf shape, the amount of shade, the openness, the closeness. And they've, for the first time in a popularly available publication, identified the qualities in garden planting that can help or hinder. And the further great advantage, I wish every state and every local government area had the equivalent, is they then looked at design, which typically has been ignored in the bushfire field. It's planning or construction. Design is fundamental, and all of us here tonight will agree on that. The CFA publication looks at 4 different garden designs to be FireWise for different ecologies, different climates. And it shows how you can separate the house from the most apparent fire direction, how you can use planting, pathways, your driveway, water, all those qualities that Chris has talked about and Steve well knows, to make a far better, safer place. So yes, I absolutely agree. I wish we had more of those publications available.
And it's funny, we're literally put it in yesterday for our DFES, which is the West Australian equivalent, who are finally saying we need to have our own FireWise guard. And I'll put a plug in for grey water. People are often saying, well, there's water restrictions. We won't always be able to water our gardens. Well, you still shower and you still do laundry. That grey water can be such a powerful tool, again, to keep your plants hydrated through the summer. Hydrated plants are less likely to burn because they've got fat cells full of water. So all of that is going to help keep those potential FireWise plants even more of an asset for you. So, get a grey water system if you don't already, because it can be a really powerful way to keep that garden hydrated.
Thank you, Chris and Nigel. A question I might hand over to Steve, again, coming from YouTube. Do councils have general zoning for fire ratings, or is that something that is assessed on a property by property basis?
There's what's called a bushfire planning layer that's that you can see whether your property or your lot is captured within that bushfire prone land mapping. That's done by local councils, and if your lot is captured under that layer, then your lot is designated as bushfire prone. And what that means is if you go to submit any sort of development application, you've triggered that layer, and therefore a bushfire assessment is required. It can be broken down into complying development, and to meet complying development, you have to be under BAL 29 or less, and as Nigel discussed in his presentation, that's that mid-level. But generally speaking, development applications range from BAL 12.5 all the way to flame zone, and there's different levels of risk. But to answer the question, yeah, look, you can go online, there's a tool you can see, and whether your lot is captured as bushfire prone. And if it is, then that's something you may need to consider. And look, it's also, I do a lot of pre-purchase advice because people want to buy new lots, and those people that think ahead a little bit and investigate their bushfire risk before they purchase, understand a little bit more about what they're up against, not just with building costs, but what's needed in terms of asset protection zones. So being prepared and thinking ahead a little bit, and it's going to assist a lot.
Steve, rather, could I suggest you just explain the 3 or 4 key principles that determine the BAL level? The things you look at every time when you're doing a BAL assessment.
Look, okay, yeah, that's a good point. Look, bushfire attack levels generated at the basic level is between the type of vegetation. So generally speaking, in Lithgow and the Blue Mountains, we're talking about forest, the highest rated or the most fuel that generates the highest risk. So unless you're in the grassland area or like with paddocks and pasture land, you're probably going to be up against the forest. The second input that we calculate is slope. So the amount of downslope, so if you're up a hill and the fire's coming up towards you, the higher that slope, the higher risk you are, and that'll generate a higher bushfire attack level. And the third input is obviously the distance from your dwelling or your house to the bush. So we put those 3 together, and that dictates or outputs your bushfire attack level. There are some other inputs we can play with. If we go down that road, and we can play with different slopes and different inputs such as flame width and things, but that's getting technical. So generally speaking, the self-assessment kit, if you use that, we'll just have those 3 inputs. It's worth noting that generally speaking, it's using your eye level to work out slope is tricky. Usually I rely on 2-metre contour data for most of my slope assessment calculations. And what's often misinterpreted is actually calculating the slope. It's the slope actually under the hazard, the bush, not the slope between you and the bush. And that's often done incorrectly. So you need to go to where the actual bush starts and work out the slope from that point downwards or upwards. If you've got an upslope from your house, it's generally the BAL levels or the distance required for the different BAL levels will come down. And as you go towards 20 degrees, the extreme, the distance for all those BAL, for example, at flame zone is going to, the distance for flame zone under a 20-metre slope is a 20-degree slope is going to be extreme, like it can be up to 80 metres. So those are the things you need to consider when you're want to, and the challenge here in the Blue Mountains, and I'll do a lot of the bed and breakfast assessments because they're always situated, and we want to live in where the beautiful views are under escarpments, but they're often the higher risk developments, because where there's a beautiful view, there's often a steep slope on the land. So in Lithgow itself, during the fires, we're luckily in the valley here in the township that most of the fires came on a downslope run towards the township, and we had plenty of resources in town to deal with that. But we saw what happened up in Clarence and Dargan with those extreme slopes running towards those buildings and the homes that lost in those areas. And from personal experience, the homes that lost and didn't and survived in Clarence and Dargan came down to that asset protection zone maintenance and those and having that safe firewise, as Chris mentioned, protection around your home. And there are lots of old stock homes in the area that will, need to be considered with some upgrades. So look, we've got a diverse range of environments in the area, from extreme ups like forest runs to pasture land. So everyone's going to be in a different sort of situation, but that's, in a nutshell, that's how the bushfire attack levels come. And people that ring me are often focused on bushfire attack levels because that's where the cost comes down to. But it's often access and water supply and those other things that we need to be considered as well, and landscaping. So we have to take a holistic view about bushfire and consider all aspects. And understandably, cost is the big one for consumers, but gardens and asset protection zones, water access are all part of the picture.
Thanks, Steve. A question that has come through via Facebook this evening. To what extent does this all apply to houses in the centre of the city? Who would like to do the first response to that question? Nigel.
Well, as we've said, it's burning embers which can ignite half a kilometres away from the fire front. So you may think you're safe, but who knows? Again, if I was living in the middle of Lithgow, I would still be considering my firewise garden. I would still be looking at the nature of the house construction, and I would still be looking at decks. I live in an old house. I'm in bushfire prone. I'm at Katoomba. 2 years ago, at the start of the horrendous bushfire season, put in a very large water tank connected to another one, a fire pump and fire hose, knowing that, unfortunately, Blue Mountains, 74% of Blue Mountains properties are officially bushfire affected. Lithgow and other areas are less, but unfortunately, there is no certainty that that one burning ember at the wrong time in the wrong wind direction couldn't cause chaos in the middle of town. You did lose houses on the edge of town well and truly in the previous fires.
Yeah.
Steve?
Go, Steve.
If we're talking about urban settings, I mean, in Sydney, where I did a lot of my previous experiences as a consultant, there are a lot of small pockets of bushland, and and some are higher risk and some are lower. Anything more than 1 hectare, which generally speaking is a couple of football fields in size, is going to pop the full force of the bushfire attack level. There is space to downgrade some of the vegetation to lower hazards, but they have to meet certain volumes of size and area. And generally speaking, in urban settings, if you're near the bush, you may be captured by that bushfire prone land mapping layer that I discussed earlier. And if you are, then you do have to meet those bushfire conditions, and you will be triggered if you do development. But look, and also tonight's more about practical solutions it's not all about development, it's about planning for bushfire. And we've seen in parts of Sydney, recently and in the past, that have had bushfires impact on the urban setting. So they're not immune to what we're dealing with out here. And you only have to look at the size and the time scale of the Gospers fire and how long that went for, and how it impacted everywhere from, down here across to Sydney and all the way up to the Central Coast and out towards Mudgee. And it was a huge fire, and it impacted a lot of different environments. So, when we talk about timescale, and we have, our memories can be short sometimes, but these do come back. The fuel does start to accumulate again, and the tonnes per hectare, as we talk in the business, will build up again. So, and that's across the state. And Sydney itself is surrounded by national parks, and same with our other capital cities and large towns. So it's something that all Australians need to consider.
And indeed, on that score, we have a lot of developments and I've got to be honest here, a lot of greedy developers want to squeeze as many lots in as they can, and they push back against the environment, and we often leave our little wetlands, which is lovely, except you've got houses right up against them. And I've taken a photo where we have these beautiful big melaleucas in WA called Melaleuca raphiophila, and they have trunks on them. They're massive, and they are absolute incendiaries. And you've got them literally right up against these urban developments, and the fire that could go through there, and you've got increased risk of arson. So yeah, they can be incredibly damaging, and people, of course, don't necessarily understand fire. So they're sitting inside on a hot day, they got Netflix on, the air conditioner's on, and it's just could be a vector to get those embers into the house. And we've had houses literally collapse in because the embers were just being expressed through the house with the air conditioning system. So there's legacy problems as well in terms of the way we've allowed housing to go right up against bushland, which now is a big risk. So yeah, it can, I agree with everything that's been said. It can be just as big an issue in our urban areas.
And can I add that increasingly we're seeing, in starting with ACT, parts of New South Wales and elsewhere, that new subdivisions will not permitted unless they're BAL 29 or less. In that, too late, there is the understanding that you don't put more people, more houses in risk's way, when we are now far more sophisticated the last 10 or 20 years of understanding what the principles are. And now governments are starting to regulate to prevent new development in high and extreme areas. But the key point, one I made to the Royal Commission a year and a half ago, was there's about 9.9 million houses in Australia. And depending which statistic you prefer, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million of them are highly bushfire affected, and they already exist. So the biggest problem is retrofitting when we look at the total whole, because new construction or major additions are all now highly regulated in terms of what materials you may or may not use. The biggest risk is what's all around us, our everyday construction built over the last 20, 50 or 150 years. That's what needs to be addressed.
Absolutely. I say to people, it's like climate change. People think it's an existential threat, and I go, no, fire has jumped the queue. It's ahead of us now, and we're playing catch up. We're going, oh my God, where did these big fires come from? And so we've got a big, steep learning curve to really, as I said, fire wise and what that means. I'm an optimist, and I believe in inspiring and empowering people. So I think this is a really important channel. It gives people something constructive that they can do, but make no mistake, we have to be thinking along these lines in the legacy developments, and that's an jaw-dropping stat you've got there, Nigel. And yeah, the way we develop into the future, but it's achievable, and we can do a lot to make these places safer and, I believe, more sustainable.
Absolutely achievable. And that has been our final question that has been sent through for this evening. We would like to give a sincere thanks to all our panellists this evening and our speakers, Bill Robb, Nigel Bell, Chris Ferreira and Steve Horton. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.